Aquatic biomes, my favorite. As we go through aquatic biomes, you should be able to identify the major freshwater biomes and the major marine biomes. Freshwater biomes typically have no to low salinity. They include things like streams, rivers, lakes, ponds. We even have freshwater wetlands. I am a freshwater biologist. That's actually called a limnologist. And we study inland boundary waters, so waters that are trapped by land. So a stream starts at the top of a mountain range somewhere. There's usually springs. They come up out of the ground from the aquifers. And this flowing fresh water may collect and gather and start an original stream. Another way a stream would start would be if there's a lot of snow and precipitation on top of a mountain. Eventually, it starts to run off, and that can be just due to temperature or to rain, the snow melting, and so that can also be the actual start of a stream. But streams are typically narrow and they carry relatively small amounts of water, whereas a river is really wide, carries a large amount of water. And so that's what we use to define the difference between the two. Lakes and ponds contain standing water, at least some of which is too deep to support emergent vegetation. Those are plants that are rooted at the bottom of the body of water, whereas lakes are larger than ponds, but as with streams and rivers, there's really no clear point or difference between the two. But essentially, lakes and ponds will contain stagnant water that hangs out there for a little while, at least long enough to go through a cycle and to create these zones. There's a couple of different zones that form in fresh water. We call them the Littoral Zone and the Limnetic Zone are two major ones. The Littoral Zone is where all the action happens. That's where photosynthesis takes place. Algae, plants, they grow there. The limnetic zone is a zone of open water in a pond or lake. In this zone, rooted plants can no longer survive. Sometimes you see floating algae, phytoplankton, but those are really the only type of photosynthetic organisms you see. The limnetic zone extends as deep as the sunlight can penetrate, and very deep lakes can also contain a profundal zone. Because sunlight does not reach this zone, producers do not survive there. So nutrients are not easily recycled when photosynthesis is absent. Bacteria decompose a lot of the detritus that reaches this zone that falls all the way to the bottom, but they consume, an oxygen process. As a result, all the dissolved oxygen that is available in this area is also not sufficient enough to support anything that's of large life value. So the muddy bottom of a lake is what we call the benthic zone. This is a little different from the profundal zone because usually when we talk about profundal, we're talking about water, like the physical water space that is absent of light, absent of a lot of nutrients, absent of organisms. The benthic zone is the actual physical muddy bottom of a lake or pond. So you can better see it in this diagram, our lake zones here, where there is a area that photosynthesis takes place, life occurs, and you can imagine that if a lake is deep enough, that's when we get a profundal zone. Benthic zones exist throughout all lakes and ponds. They vary in what kind of life can live there. There are three major types of lakes or ponds. We call those oligotrophic, mesotrophic, or eutrophic, or how those are pronounced. Oligotrophic are lakes with a very low productivity. Low productivity means very low photosynthesis, and so oftentimes those lakes are very, very clear. Not a lot going on in a clear lake or pond. Mesotrophic is more on the moderate level, and eutrophic describes a lake that has a high level of productivity. There's a lot of algae growing, there's a lot of photosynthesis, there's a lot of stuff going on, and so a eutrophic lake or pond is very difficult to see through. Freshwater wetlands are aquatic biomes that are submerged or saturated by water for at least some portion of the year. They're usually shallow enough for emergent vegetation, plants to actually come out through the soil and emerge through the water. There's a lot of examples of freshwater wetlands. We call them swamps, marshes, bogs. There actually is technically differences between all of these things. Swamps are wetlands that contain emergent trees, where dominant trees actually grow through the actual water part. Marshes and wetlands contain primarily like woody vegetation, like cattails, sedges. You see a lot of those really, really tall grasses. And unlike those, bogs are actually specifically very acidic. They are wetlands that typically have a lot of moss and then these very special spruce trees. But the water has this very, very low pH, and that's usually what makes a bog very different, caused by tannic acid. And just as a general rule, a freshwater wetland is among the most productive biome on the planet.